It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very pleased to be able to speak at an event arranged by the Bristol Natural History Consortium. I was down here as a student years ago and got to know many of the organisations firsthand in the consortium, and I know you're doing fantastic work. And actually, a similar thing has now happened up in Cambridge, where I now live. We have a thing called the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, which has pulled together lots of the very international NGOs in particular up there, working in the tropics, many of them, alongside the university and other organisations to create a really powerful intellectual resource. And I was just thinking this morning that one of the things we really must do at some point is to get the Bristol Natural History Consortium to come and talk to the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, because your great ability on the communication side and their great strength on the academic and scientific side, I think, would be hugely complementary. So we should have a little think about that at some point. That's another day, however. So this morning I wanted to just do three short things, really, in the little time I've got available. One was to talk about the impact of the communications that conservationists and environmentalists have done in recent years, and just to remind us what we've achieved. The second is to talk a little bit about the context for modern conservation and environmental challenges and how communications needs to reflect that, and then say a bit about how we might address that challenge going forward. So I think the first thing to note is that, you know, we've been in this business, the conservation community, for about 4 decades, a little bit longer in some respects, and we've managed to communicate with an increasingly larger public and putting across powerful messages about how we should be valuing and then protecting nature. We've managed to communicate about disappearing species, declining habitats, the impacts of different kinds of pollution, and we've managed to bring these into a public debate that has in many respects led to positive change. And so there has been a transformation in awareness. I think we can confidently say that's happened. Conservation organisations have grown enormously in size, and I know that many of the groups I was working with in the early 1980s are now literally 10 times bigger. And as a result of growing their capacity, they've developed a very considerable public mandate. And you have organisations now like Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, RSPB, WWF, Wildlife Trust, and many, many others are really now quite influential organisations with quite a lot of access to the political process. And as a result of that, you know, you can look back over the last 20 years in particular, and you can see some really quite dramatic changes in terms of how society has reacted to environmental challenges. So the emissions that were causing acid rain, when I was a student down here in the early 1980s campaigning on that subject, we've reduced that pollution load by about 80%. We've managed to pretty much phase out the worst chemicals causing ozone depletion. One of the most significant threats to life on Earth in recent times has been pretty much resolved through an international treaty process. The number of protected areas has soared. Something like 12% of the Earth's land area now is in national parks and other designated sites. Species recovery plans have been put in place, and Kathy mentioned my work on parrots back in the late 1980s. You know, at that time I had like 110 species on different levels of threat, some of them critically endangered. None of them have gone extinct. This is looking back now 20 years ago. This is something I think we should be very proud of. We've phased out various pesticides. Rivers and air is cleaner. When I was a student down here, this point around here was about as far east as the buzzard went, certainly at this level in the UK. They didn't breed any further east than here. If you wanted to see red kites, you had to go to one little site in mid-Wales. Both of those things I can see now on the outskirts of Cambridge. They're breeding there. Really quite incredible positive change that has taken place. So a lot of that has been achieved through effective communication. Certainly we had to have a strong scientific case, we had to have practical projects and technological innovation, but most of those changes were won in large part through being able to speak to people and to break political deadlocks. A lot of those things wouldn't have happened had we left it to industry to sort it out on its own or to the free market. Big fights took place about whether regulations should be introduced to do a lot of those things, but they happened anyway. And so I think, you know, we can be very proud of where we've reached. However, and as you all know, we're not by any means at the end of this. And although we've managed to manage some of the symptoms in terms of the environmental crisis that's affecting our planet, many of the underlying trends have not only remained there, they've actually worsened. So habitat degradation at the global level outside the protected areas obviously is continuing and is now joined by the relatively new challenge, certainly in a public communication sense, of climate change. And both of those things are being driven, the loss of habitats, biodiversity loss and global warming, both of those things are being driven by a still surging increase globally in demand for natural resources, from fresh water to fish to minerals to timber and all the rest of it, and massive global growth in consumption, of course, which is driving that. And so if you look at this period when we've had this incredible lifting of awareness and those positive changes I've talked about, you know, at the same time, paradoxically, we've been living through what you might regard as a great acceleration, I think, is how history might come to look back at this period. Starting in the 1950s, you've seen this great surge, this great acceleration reflected in a whole series of different curves you can plot on graphs. Rising population, demand for natural resources, greenhouse gas emissions, growth in GDP. All of these things have surged over a short period. Certainly in any historic sense, it's really quite an amazing change that's taken place. And that has in turn been driven by a culture of what you might regard ever increasing expectations. As we've gone from the 1950s to the modern age and this culture that we now live in, people have expected more and more and more to be delivered at less and less personal cost to themselves. That's obviously been achieved through an era of prolonged economic growth, which has led to this modern phenomenon of consumerism, which has started in the Western democracies, in the United States in particular, and which is now spreading across the globe. And any of you who have travelled to India and China, you'll see an accelerated process going from basic industrialization to consumerism. It took 200 years in the West. It's taking a decade or less in some of the emerging economies in the Southern Hemisphere. And that, the great acceleration, is, I think, something that we as a community of communicators now have to address. And Kathy mentioned some of the points that came from last year's conference. It's certainly on the agenda, but I think we have to get much more into this, because the rising demand cannot be sustained. We've reached a point where a planet crunch, simply put, is already upon us, where the renewable capacity of the planet is being depleted more quickly than we can possibly regard as sustainable. And the day each year when we reach the point where the renewable capacity of the Earth has been used up gets earlier year on year. This year, it was September the 25th, we used up the renewable capacity of the planet. By mid-century, if we carry on like we are now, it'll be something like the middle of April. And that, obviously, if we are to maintain climatic stability and conserve the living fabric of this planet, cannot happen.